Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another Q&A video on Forgotten Weapons. I'm Ian McCollum, and I have a whole slew of questions for you today, brought to you, as always, by the fine folks on Patreon and by the Kiro Distillery up in Isokiro, Finland. That is a distillery that I visited a couple of years ago and totally fell in love with. They make a fantastic 100% Finnish rye whiskey using basically the best of American and Scottish whiskey making technique. They have a pair of amazing Scottish produced copper pot stills for this. And they do primarily rye whiskeys, also some gin, some vodka, cream liqueur. My favorites are the ryes. And today I am back to having, once again, the peat smoke rye. I'm a sucker for Islay smoky scotches, and combining that sort of technique with a Finnish rye whiskey is fantastic. Yes, fantastic indeed. So if you are interested in trying them out, or if you like their whiskeys because you have tried them and you would like to get some more, you can use the code SaunaWhiskey10. I have that written in the description text below. At their online store for sales in the US, Germany, and Finland, get yourself 10% off and send a small commission on the purchase to me, which helps run Forgotten Weapons. So anyway, I will be enjoying this through our Q&A today. Let's dig into our first question, which comes from Paul. Paul says, Brandon Herrera has made a video on the Thompson SMG chambered in the powerful 30-06 cartridge, and only one exists to this day, and it's essentially an experimental version of making a Thompson more powerful. What are your thoughts on that particular Thompson experimental piece? The video, yes, but the gun in general, because it came up for sale at Rock Island last year, got quite a lot of press because it was a very clicky sort of idea. Like, it's a Thompson in 30-06. It's amazing. Who knew you could take a blowback submachine gun, sort of blowback submachine gun, and just convert it into a huge rifle cartridge. And it sold for an insane amount of money. I think it was the hammer bid was something like $90,000. And those two factors, like the rarity, because yes, indeed, it is a one-off piece for reasons that we'll get to in just a moment, the rarity and the price and the hype contribute to it having this air of it's excellent, it should be paid a lot of respect, and it's an amazing piece of firearms technology, when in reality, I think the truth is the exact opposite of that. That gun is a complete dumpster fire. It is an experimental piece. It is the equivalent of going into your garage and just hacking something together because, you know what, like, what the heck, we'll give it a shot. It's not going to work, but we're going to throw something at the Army wants a new 30-06 automatic rifle. They want to, they're interested in maybe replacing the BAR. And what the heck, we have an R&D department. Let's just knock something together. We've done rifles in 30-06 before, right? Yes? Okay, well, just do another one. Give the Department of War something to look at. Now, there was actually a pretty interesting internal mechanism in that gun. There is an interesting internal mechanism in that gun, which unfortunately Brandon didn't look at, didn't recognize. It sort of, there's a plunger in the face of the bolt, and when a cartridge is chambered, it actually sort of expands the wing, the front of the bolt face into the receiver to create extra friction, to create a theoretical delay to it. It would have been a fantastic gun to take apart because there is some interesting stuff inside it. However, that gun never went anywhere, and I think everyone involved in that project knew it wasn't going to go anywhere. It is not that different from the 30 carbine caliber Thompsons that were introduced when the US was looking for a 30 caliber carbine. Thompson, the Auto Ordnance Company, John Thompson was long gone by this point, the Auto Ordnance Company just kind of knocked up a stretched out 30 caliber carbine Thompson and submitted it to the trials, and it was terrible. Of course it was terrible. It was this blowback 30 carbine in a gun that was already way too heavy. It was awful. It went nowhere, and no one expected it to go anywhere. And the same thing is true of that one 30-06 Thompson. It was made in December of 1943. Contrary to some of the hype that Brandon threw into his video, like, certainly the firearms historical community knew that gun existed. It hasn't been hidden away. It's been in a private collection, but not one where the guy was trying to keep it a secret. It's been documented in at least, I mean, the most prominent book on the Thompson out there is Thompson, An American Legend by Tracy Hill, published by Collector Grade. It's been out there for decades. This gun is pictured and described, not extensively described, but it is pictured and explained a bit in that book. So, like, this wasn't a myth, this wasn't a surprise, this is a gun that, yeah, only one was made because it's incredibly stupid. And while it is rare and it is different, that doesn't mean that it's good. Frankly, that Thompson is kind of like the fork you see in the meme with all the tongs gnarled up. Like, just because you're special doesn't mean you're actually better. If one wanted to look at equally rare, far more interesting, and far more important Thompsons, I would say the initial two Thompson prototypes, the Persuader and what was the second one, I think was called the Annihilator 1. Both of which only one was made, the same as this 30-06 abomination. But those are actually guns that had a developmental track. These were what led to the actual production Thompson submachine guns. They both exist, but there's only one of each one. Those are in museum collections. And those would be far more interesting guns from any sort of historical perspective. So it is also worth pointing out that the Thompson, the 30-06 Thompson experimental from 1943 is not the only 30-06 Thompson gun. In the 1920s, Auto Ordnance, under John Thompson, was making experimental 30-06 caliber semi-automatic rifles and using basically the same internal mechanism as the Thompson, but making them from scratch, not trying to like kludge them together from a scrap Thompson submachine gun frame. And there are a reasonable number of those guns out there. I have videos on a couple of them. That's where the magazine for this experimental one came from. So those are also worth taking a look at if you're interested in the concept of a 30-06 Thompson gun, because there are not a bunch, there are a number of those out there and around. So anyway, that one particular 30-06 Thompson is an interesting gun. It's worthy of documentation and filming, of course, but it is not worthy of being treated like a paragon of firearms developmental history, because it was, in fact, a dead end that everybody involved knew was going to be a dead end. And it was kind of a, like, just for appearance's sake, we have to submit something because we're a big firearms company, but we don't have a BAR replacement. Figure out something, throw it out there, and then we can all move on with our lives and maybe try and sell a simplified Thompson submachine gun to the Army a bunch. All right, our next question is from ZC. Says, why did self-loading magazines not catch on outside of submachine guns? The only rifle I can think of would be the FG-42. I am surprised post-World War II battle rifles did not load from the side to allow the user to get as low to the ground as possible. So, first off, that is kind of the commonly accepted benefit, or a commonly retold benefit of a side magazine. But it's not really a benefit at all, because if you take a typical magazine of that time, which would hold 20 rounds, and you put it in the bottom of the gun, it's really hard to get so low to the ground that the magazine is the thing that prevents you from getting lower while still being able to actually use the gun. Being able to get your face down that close to the ground and actually line up sights and use them is tricky. The magazine really isn't a limiting factor here. It can be on some guns. A Sturmgewehr is a great example of a gun where the magazine really kind of is long enough that it is an obstruction if you're trying to get prone, low prone. Sometimes when you have the 30-round, more modern 30-round mags, AK mags, sometimes sort of, but AK mags and 30-round AR mags are actually kind of at that length where they make a reasonably good monopod. They're about as low as you feasibly can normally get. In addition, when you're at a shooting range, it's, the lower you get, the lower of a silhouette you can present, and you always have a clear shot at your target. Out in the real world, there's grass, there's rocks, there's trees, there's all sorts of stuff on the ground, and the ground's not always flat. And if you've got the muzzle 3 inches off the ground, the chances are pretty good that you're going to have a whole slew of muzzle obstructions between your muzzle and whatever your theoretical target is. So the side magazine doesn't actually provide much real benefit for how low you can get with the gun. Now, it does provide some other potential mechanical benefits, the main one being it allows you to shorten the gun a little bit by allowing you to have the trigger mechanism and the magazine at the same physical location in the gun. If the magazine is on the bottom, the trigger has to be either in front of it, like a bullpup, or behind it, which is the traditional setup. And if the trigger group's behind the magazine, in theory, you've extended, you now have a length of pull that needs to be somewhere in the 13-inch range or so just to fit human beings. And so if your trigger's behind the magazine, then you have to have the buttstock that much longer. Whereas if you can move the trigger up and have it co-located with the magazine, you can shorten the butt of the gun up a bit. That's a benefit if you have a design that allows you to exploit a shortened buttstock. That's one where it could have been more useful, and I think the reason that it didn't get any real wider acceptance is that there is also a downside of balance, and having a fully loaded magazine sticking off the side of the gun is a little bit awkward. I don't think it's all that awkward. Having played around with some FG42s, you notice it, but it's not that big a deal. But that doesn't just because it isn't really a big deal in the field doesn't mean that it won't be treated like a big deal in a development adoption process, which often takes place in a boardroom with potentially people who haven't actually done a lot of shooting in a while. You can see all sorts of odd decisions made in firearms procurement development cycles. And kind of like the idea that you can't shoot a lever action rifle prone, which isn't really true, but is often credited with being part of the reason that lever action rifles weren't more widely adopted by militaries. I think the same thing kind of holds true for the side-mounted magazine and its weight and balance issues. It is a little bit of an issue, but I think it's one that gets magnified by procurement officers who are, of course, used to the traditional, normal, the way it's always been done. And they take one look at that side mag and go, no, take it. We're just getting rid of that. So I know that's not the greatest answer, but those are the best two factors that I can think of. Next up, we have Andrew. Says, did Hiram Maxim ever design a firearm other than his machine gun family that was manufactured in quantity? No, actually he didn't. There are a few other guns associated with Maxim. The one that comes to mind right away is the Maxim Silverman semi-automatic pistol, which is a really cool, interesting pistol, which was actually probably mostly work just done by his assistant named Silverman. But Maxim was running the company and providing the money, and Silverman was doing it as an employee, so Maxim's name gets on the gun. But that wasn't even made in quantity. It was just a small handful of pistols. The thing about Maxim is he wasn't a gun guy. Maxim was an engineer and an inventor. And he started off his career in gas, as in natural gas for lighting, in that period when that's how lighting in urban areas worked. Street lights were gas. Internal house lights were run on piped gas. He did that. He then got into electricity, and because of competition in the electrical field, he ends up agreeing to take himself out of the electrical field, goes to England, and starts tinkering with guns and invents the Maxim machine gun. And after that all kind of plays out for him career-wise, he then moves into aviation and starts tinkering with powered flight. So he didn't, there are some gun designers like John Browning, whose entire career was firearms. And when they finish one gun, they move on to another gun. They're perpetually employed by gun companies. Maxim was a little different. Maxim was an inventor. He started his own company. He wasn't the employee, aside from mergers that happened later on. He really wasn't an employee of a large firearms company hired to make various gun designs. He was an entrepreneur and an inventor, and wandered from interest to interest, and the Maxim gun was obviously very successful, so it occupied a large part of his life and his career. But after that, he moved on to things that weren't guns. Ryan says, was there ever any hope for the double clip Garand experiments, or was that always destined to be a dead end? I can't think of any multi-Mannlicher system attempts. Did the Good Idea Fairy really only visit us once with this? There are probably some other multi-end block clip loading systems, but I can't think of any of them off the top of my head, and certainly like none of them were, I'm always worried to say never, but none of them were ever mass production guns. If you're not familiar with it, by the way, what Ryan is referring to here is an experimental M1 that you could actually load 2 standard clips into. So you had an 16 round capacity with 2 clips. And I think the only reason that it was done that way is because it was developed after the M1 was already in service. And so they had 8 round clips, and the idea was, how can we make this maybe a larger capacity weapon without changing too much logistically? If it had been an initial early development, it would have been theoretically a 16 round clip or something sort of in that range. The problem with that sort of system, and the reason why we don't see much of it, is I think the same reason we don't see a whole lot of 10 round stripper clip loaded guns. We have the Lee Enfield, and we have the early Swiss rifles that use 2 6-round chargers for a 12-round magazine. But the issue you get with those guns is the benefit is limited to only the first time you load the magazine. So the idea is you're going to go do some shooting, you preload the magazine to its full capacity, but then once it's empty and you're reloading it, reloading one 8-round clip twice, like load 8, shoot 8, load 8, shoot 8, takes the same amount of time as load 8, load a second 8, and then shoot 16. So you've got the significant extra complexity for having all the mechanism to deal with 2 independent clips. But after that first loading is fired, you don't get any benefit because it takes you however many seconds to load a clip. And if you're just doing that same action twice, there's not really actually any benefit. The gun gets much more complex, the gun gets heavier. This is the thing with Lee Enfields, is if you do a mad minute with a Lee Enfield, your benefit is really coming from the fact that the cock on close is an easy bolt system to run fast, where the magazine loading is much less of an issue. Think about whether you're going to run that with, load 10, shoot 10, and then do you load a single clip and fire it, and load a single clip and fire it, or do you load 2 clips in a row and then fire them both? It really doesn't make any difference to the ultimate number of rounds downrange. So no, as far as I know, we never did get any other double clip loading guns like that. Let's see. Next up we have Josh. Says, U.S. last-ditch style rifles, more likely a simplified M7 or now M8, or a fallback to the civilian market / industry for more AR-15 style rifles. Well, if we were in some theoretical, Great War version 3 and had to produce infantry rifles by the hundreds of thousands and had to simplify them and had to come up with a last-ditch version of the American military rifle, the problem is, as of right now, the problem is not going to be the mechanics of the M7 or M8, and can we simplify it, or do we go back to all, just issuing soldiers with PSA ARs? The issue is going to be the ammunition. So, well, the short version is the rifle's going to be a standard AR-15 if you have to do a last-ditch gun. And it's not because you can't simplify the M7, although that definitely would be trickier because of its very high pressure. You're going to have definitely some different material requirements for that gun that are not as easy to simplify. But the bigger issue is, at least for now, we basically can't manufacture real 6.8x51 high-pressure wartime ammunition in any sort of quantity. And if you're going through that many rifles that you have to build a last-ditch rifle, you've got to make a crap ton of ammo, or else what's the point of having the rifles? And we're not able to do it yet. Like, that production don't work. I've had the chance to speak to some people sort of behind the scenes on some of this, and it's not a great situation. They can make the practice ammo, that's fine, and sort of maybe the hybrid case practice ammo, but the high pressure stuff is still causing huge problems for ammunition manufacture. So, like in any sort of, the better comparison would not necessarily be what's the last-ditch Arasaka version of a modern American World War III thing. It would look more like the Italians in World War II, where right before the war starts, they adopt 735. And then as soon as they have to put that into really serious production, they realize the logistical issues of having 735 and 65, and they can't make enough of the new stuff, and they've got a lot of the old stuff, and they say, screw it, and they just devolve back to 65. It's good enough, and it's way easier for us to produce and supply right now, and we'll take these 735 guns and, well, give a bunch of them to the Finns who will hate them. That's what would happen in a scenario with the US right now. The 6.8 by 51 adoption would be rolled back pretty darn quickly in favor of, like, just make some regular M4s with regular 5.56 ball or M855 semi-armor piercing. Edward says, with the recent replication of the Browning high power, why didn't anyone do it with a 1911 trigger? Well, because then you wouldn't really have a high power. The 1911 trigger and the high power trigger are completely different mechanisms. The 1911 pulls backwards. It's got a stirrup that goes around the magazine and pushes on a sear in the back of the gun. The high power is a plunger. You pull the trigger and it pushes a plunger up into the slide, which pivots a lever in the slide, which then pushes down on a sear back behind the magazine. So, in theory, you could probably, the 1911 trigger is a nicer trigger, but if you were to try and make a high power with a 1911 trigger, there's going to be a lot of R&D work involved. You can't just copy either one because this is a hybrid system now. And if you want the gun to look like a Browning high power, you're going to have to redesign the system to somehow incorporate a 1911 style trigger. And you've got a lot of engineering costs in that, while the purpose of the actually couple of reproduction high powers that we've seen introduced is to be able to take a known good gun and just make it and not have to really invent the wheel all over again at all. Just, that's good. People like the way it looks. Copy both the way it works, because we can just essentially reverse engineer that pretty easily. It's a gun that's been around for a very long time and is pretty well known. And we can sell it based on the looks, that it looks like a classic high power. And once you start making big mechanical changes inside the gun, you risk losing both of those benefits. And then all of a sudden, you're not making a reproduction high power. You're making some totally brand new gun that you then have to just give people a reason to actually purchase. Let's see, Will says, in the early days of self-loading designs, everyone was after an action that would work at the rifle and handgun scales. Is delayed blowback the magic bullet that they were dreaming of? No. I mean, sort of. Delayed blowback systems can work in both. The problem is, there's really no benefit to trying to force a rifle and a pistol to use the same operating mechanism. It feels good from an organizational perspective and tabulating things on spreadsheets and having numbers, but when it comes to the actual practical application of the gun, rifles benefit from different things than handguns do, self-loading rifles and self-loading handguns, in terms of physical scale and the pressures that they operate at. And it's kind of like saying we were trying to take the same engine and use it in a motorcycle and also a truck, or even just a car. Well, you know what? You have different niche requirements for an internal combustion engine in a vehicle, depending on the size and the use and the purpose of the vehicle. And it just, I mean, in one way, it'd be kind of neat to be able to say we stock one engine and we use it in motorcycles and in trucks. But inevitably, both the motorcycles and the trucks they both kind of suck. The same thing applies to firearms. If you try to rigidly apply the same mechanical system to a rifle and a handgun, you're going to end up with probably both of them subpar. We've also done a lot of optimization in firearms mechanisms by this point, and anything that's really handicapped by being subpar for a needless reason like that is going to have a very difficult time seeing any real use today. It's just going to fail in the market. fail to the guns that are much more specialized and adapted to their particular roles. There was a similar move, I think it's pretty interesting to see, with a couple of companies who are trying to make one gun that they could have as both a concealed carry compact pistol and also a military service pistol. And you'll see this with Walther did it and Mauser did it. And usually one of the two will succeed and the other one will just disappear, only to be seen on places like this channel. Eventually what they realize is the 9mm parabellum requires some sort of delayed or locked breech mechanism, and the compact gun, which was typically a 32 ACP or maybe even 25 ACP, those are better as simple blowback. But you end up with things like Walther makes a number of simple blowback 32s during the World War I era, and they're fine. They work great, they're popular, they're successful. Then they make the Walther Model 9, I think it was the 9, that is a straight blowback 9 parabellum service pistol. And it's terrible because straight blowback 9 is not a great solution. Yes, there are some guns that make it work, but it's not an ideal solution. And for Walther, it wasn't great. Dreisa does the same thing. The Dreisa 9 parabellum gun is not great. The 32 is not that great either, but the 32 actually works okay. So anyway, similar sort of thing. People like the idea of standardization in this sort of thing, but it doesn't actually bring real benefits, and it does bring real detriments to the guns. Let's see. Captain Dan says, given the clear advantage of the lower bore axis, will we ever see other bottom chamber firing revolvers besides Emilio Ghissoni's Unica 6 and the Rhino, the Chiappa Rhino? There's the Russian RSH-12, but that's very niche. Is this a patent issue? One would think with the state-of-the-art manufacturing, advanced manufacturing technology, new designs would be viable. I have an old Piper Bayard 1908 in 635 that I recently cleaned, and it made me think of bottom barrel guns. So of course he's talking about the barrel being aligned with the bottom chamber of a revolver cylinder instead of the top, which has happened a couple times, but it is a pretty niche thing. And this is an interesting question, and I was looking at this question trying to figure out, like, okay, well, what is the answer to that? Why don't we have more bottom chamber firing guns? Because in semi-auto pistols, it's pretty much kind of always agreed that a lower bore axis is better. It allows faster follow-up shots, less muzzle climb. It's seen as like that's a good thing, and you want to minimize the height over bore. I think actually the issue with the revolver is going to be an argument with this very first claim here, which is there's a clear advantage to a bottom chamber firing revolver. I don't know that there actually is. People shooting revolvers are generally not doing it for splits. They're not trying to do a lot of super rapid fire. Yes, obviously there are people who can and do. There are people who use revolvers in IDPA and IPSC matches where they are shooting for speed, and especially IPSC, lots of double taps on targets, recovery speed is important, but those account for a tiny fraction of the number of revolvers sold. Most people are either using revolvers without any particular interest in maximizing their splits because you've only got 6 rounds, give or take, in the thing anyway. So like your ability to shoot a whole high volume of ammo really fast is crippled initially just by the fact that it only holds 6 rounds, and it's slower to reload than a box magazine in a semi-auto pistol. And a lot of revolvers, like one of the things that revolvers are particularly good at is using large, high-pressure, powerful cartridges, more powerful than you get in semi-auto handguns. And when you shoot a revolver with a top firing barrel, the recoil is going to kick the gun up, and that's actually a good thing. That is helping to mitigate the felt recoil of the gun. It will climb, but that absorbs a fair amount of energy. It occurs to me that when you have very low bore axis semi-auto pistols, like the Lauco Alien, you actually have noticeably increased felt recoil in your hand because there is no energy being deflected into kicking the gun up in the air. Instead, it's all just punching straight back into the heel of your hand. And if you were to do that with a 44 Magnum or a 500 Smith & Wesson Magnum or some of the other insane revolver cartridges that are out there, that becomes a lot less fun to shoot than if you can fire the thing and let it just way up in the air and use a bunch of energy doing that instead of destroying the bones in your wrist. So to what extent is rapidity of fire and minimal muzzle climb actually a benefit in revolver marketing, in revolver design and sale? I think that's the answer to this question. We don't see it because people actually, maybe without realizing it, the muzzle climb is a benefit in revolvers considering how they're typically used. Matthew says, hey Ian, assuming no issues obtaining ammo, which any one of the anti-tank rifles you've done videos on would you add to your collection and why? That's a cool, fun question. There are a couple of considerations. So my first thought is to go to an L39 Lati because I like finish arms. We've already done the Kickstarter. We're in the process of publishing a book on finished small arms that I wrote. The 20mm Lati L39 has a fantastic combat history. A lot of anti-tank rifles didn't get that much use, but the Lati did. And it'd be super cool, but the problem is it's like 8 feet long and 120 or so pounds. I didn't double check numbers, but it's really heavy and really long and just really pretty impractical to use. Even if you assume that you can get the ammunition very easily, that's like that thing doesn't fit in my car. I need to go buy a pickup truck so I can put it in the back of the truck to be able to take it to the range if I want to shoot it. And then, that's a lot of work. I don't know that I would actually use it that much. And the one that I would use, I think, would be a boys anti-tank rifle. Of the ones I've shot, the boys is one of the most pleasant to actually shoot. It does have a recoil absorbing mechanism in the gun that works pretty well. I was surprised at how not horrible it was to shoot a boys anti-tank rifle. The gun is, by anti-tank rifle standards, compact and lightweight and handy, and it's fun to shoot. And I think that would be my choice. Now, there are a number of these guns that I haven't had a chance to shoot that are also relatively light, handy guns. The German 1939 falling block single shotgun might be a cool one. I've never had the chance to shoot it. The Polish WZ-35 is basically a Mauser. Might be interesting. I think I'd probably have more fun with a boys anti-tank rifle than the Polish one. Everyone's aware of the Solitherns alongside the Latis. The Solithern is just as big and heavy as the Lati. It does have the benefit of the barrel being easily removable, so it is a bit more portable, but it's still such a big gun that I don't know that I'd actually use it much. To me, I think the boys anti-tank rifle is that sweet spot combination that would be, it's an anti-tank rifle, but it's actually still kind of fun to shoot. Next up, Sam says, given the integration of AI into our daily lives, is there any place for AI in enhancing the process of designing firearms or streamlining their manufacture? I think in terms of designing, no, I can't think of any good application. The AI models that we have are large language models, and they're really good at combining disparate bits of information and finding relationships between them. But we understand the mechanics of firearms development really pretty well. These are not super complicated systems. This isn't like trying to design an entire traffic flow grid for a 1 million person city. This isn't translating a foreign language. This is a basic set of engineering principles that we now have a solid 100 years of experience with in terms of self-loading guns. And we know the basic mechanisms and we know what the trade-offs are. And computing power has definitely a benefit in terms of figuring out, how small can we get this part while still having the necessary safety margins on it. But that's not an AI question, that's just a computation question. So no, design, I don't correct me if I'm wrong. I know there are a bunch of firearms designers who do watch the channel. If you think there is a place for AI, a role for it in this, let me know. I'd be curious about it, but I really don't think there is. In terms of streamlining the manufacture, maybe. I'm still dubious, but there's a better opportunity there, I think, for taking perhaps a complex part and calculating CNC tool paths and ideal tool sizes to use. I have only a very basic knowledge and education in CNC machining, and so I'm really not sure how much space there is available in that world to refine tool paths and planning tool paths to get that little bit of extra efficiency out of machine runtime. Again, I know there's even more CNC operators who are watching, so you tell me, what do you think? Is there a place for AI, or is this kind of like SolidWorks, the various engineering design software already does this extremely well and doesn't need to be fundamentally changed? Let's see. Christopher says, what prototype failure was a tweak away from success? There usually aren't examples of that. Usually, if it's a tweak away from success, it may fail as a prototype in one project, but if it really is a good gun, it'll come back in some other form and ends up being developed anyway, even if it failed one trial. And the best answer I can give for this would be like the AR-10, which is both a gun that was, in theory, maybe about one tweak away from maybe getting adopted as the US Army's standard rifle. There was a particularly catastrophic failure in testing with the US Army's very early AR-10s, where they were still using a composite laminate barrel design in order to save weight. It's interesting, Stoner hated the thing. He lobbied pretty hard to replace it with a standard steel barrel, but the other guys at the company were more deeply invested in the composite barrel designs. They kept it in there, and a bullet in part of the endurance testing, a bullet went sideways out the side of an AR-10 barrel through the handguard. And was that the only reason that the AR-10 didn't get adopted by the US? No, not at all. But it was a really good thing to be able to point to. And had that not happened, there is maybe a hypothetical world in which the AR-10 is able to do better and do well enough that it actually can get adopted. Now that said, the AR-10 was fundamentally a good design. And what I said at the very beginning of this question was, if you've got a fundamentally good design that just like has that one tweak that causes it to lose a trial, it'll come back in some other form. Well, the AR-10 did come back in another form. They did continue developing it, and they did end up selling it. Not in like world-changing numbers, but Guatemala, Sudan, it was tested by a bunch of NATO countries. It was adopted by the Portuguese and purchased, many thousands of them purchased by the Portuguese. And then, of course, it gets scaled down into the AR-15. But that's kind of the closest compromise I can see of fulfilling this question. It was just one tweak away, which meant that it both lost and got further developed later and was eventually successful to a limited degree. Stephen says, as a MOS 44 and AG 42B Ljungman owner, I have to ask, have you ever seen evidence of French engineers working with the Swedes? The AG42 design seems to have come out of nowhere, and I know the MOS 40 was in the tool room prototype phase when France fell to Germany, and the designers hid and or destroyed prototypes, so none are known to survive. There are actually some MOS 40s that do survive. Very few. I have seen one of them. I haven't had a chance to film it, but there are a few that do survive. Anyway, it always got to me that the AG42 used a similar gas system, even though France was very secretive about weapons design. So the answer to that is I'm not aware of any communication between the French and the Swedish designer Eklund, who did the Ljungman. These were not the first direct gas impingement guns developed using this system. There were experiments that dated several decades back. So first off, it wasn't like the MOS 40 was the first time anyone had come up with this. And it's not a complicated system. It's a really simple design idea. And we already have piston, long stroke piston guns. And it's a very short little hop from, if I'm pushing gas into this piston and then the piston pushes the bolt carrier back, well, what if I just simplify it by running the gas right to the bolt carrier and kind of just bypassing the whole piston in the first place? So there wasn't any communication that I'm aware of between the French and the Swedes, but there really didn't need to be for this gun to be the case. It is interesting, the Ljungman is a design that comes from a company with no prior firearms experience, a designer with no prior firearms experience. And so he kind of takes a look at this from an engineering perspective with a clean slate. And it makes sense to me that he would look at this and perhaps see gas piston guns that are in use and think as an engineer, well, this piston is a waste of material and of complexity. We don't need it there. We just put the gas straight back to where it's supposed to go without the prejudice of, well, the piston is kind of how it's been done for the last several decades. So that's how we need to do it, which is more along the lines of what a career gun designer might see when they look at that problem. All right, moving on. Freedom delivery says, following the example of the Ohio Ordnance H-car, are there any other century-old designs that you would be interested in seeing a modernized commercial revival of? What other guns besides the BAR have enough star power to overcome questions of cost or practicality? It's a difficult question. I mean, right from the start, the obvious one is the Sturmgewehr. The Sturmgewehr has a ton of recognition. Real examples are very expensive and limited in availability. They're all machine guns. And if someone, it's this light that's attracting flies and they keep hitting it and getting zapped and dying. If someone could actually successfully create a nice, reliable, functional, inexpensive Sturmgewehr, it would sell very well. I mean, we can even see that the 22 caliber ones from ATI sell pretty well. I bet ATI did really well on that project. It's not what I want. It's not what a lot of you guys probably want. We want one that's in 8x33 Kurz, but that's just proven to be a really difficult gun to manufacture in a historically accurate manner while still being commercially viable today. Not because there was some magic technology involved in its manufacture, but because it was designed to be made by the hundreds of thousands where the tolerable level of scrap was ridiculously high by today's standards. They didn't care. They were cranking out receiver stampings on such a large scale that if 30% of them tear and fail, who cares? We need the guns anyway. That's fine. Just scrap 30% and get the ones out that we can make work. And for a civilian manufacturer on the commercial market today, you cannot handle a 30% reject rate. It just immediately cripples the whole project. So the Sturmgewehr has so far proven to be a nut that hasn't really been cracked. The Dietrich guns are close, but have some reliability issues. Perhaps not any worse than the original German guns did. Maybe not. It's a little hard to say. Just what level of reliability was acceptable at that point for regular production guns. But the Dietrich guns tend to have a few too many issues for most people's taste on the market today. The PTR guns were a one-off and done, and costs skyrocketed and they couldn't deal with it. And of course, HMGs, Sturmgewehrs, are the classic example of a catastrophic failure of a reproduction attempt. I think a reproduction Fedorov would be really interesting, but I'm not convinced it's a viable commercial thing. And if it was, someone probably would have done it by now. The one that I do think would be cool, would make money, and wouldn't be that difficult to make, and could be a successful project is, and I've said this before, the Burgess folding 12-gauge shotgun. People love that concept. People think they're awesome. It's a pump 12-gauge. It's not that complicated. You don't have to, it was designed for the same sort of, it was designed for manufacturing in a way that CNC can adapt to it really quite easily. It's folding. That would be a neat system, but the folding mechanism doesn't really add that much problem to the engineering of the gun, that's the one that I think could be done. I think there are a bunch of companies out there that theoretically could do it. Maybe some of the companies doing reproduction Old West stuff, or maybe someone like, Mossberg, Winchester, a producer of modern, regular shotguns. Beretta. Beretta bought Uberti. Beretta is a massive company that also owns a number of shotgun manufacturers. They've got plenty of expertise in-house to make that gun if they decided that they wanted to. That's the one that I think would be viable. Cosmoline Daydream says, what are your general thoughts on the Maxim 1910 as used in World War I, World War II, and beyond? By which he would mean Korea and, maybe not Vietnam, and Ukraine today. Even today, where they've been cited in surprising numbers during the Russian-Ukraine war. Those guns are durable. Maxim guns are durable. They were designed to just fire endlessly. They're water-cooled industrial machines. And that's why they're still around in combat today. Now, there are some real downsides to them. They are not tactically flexible, mobile guns. They're guns that are really, when the Maxim gun was developed, most countries looked at it and decided that it fit into the artillery branch of the military system. And the very early ones were mounted on carriages that looked just like artillery carriages, with the giant 4-foot-tall wheels and the trail on the back. And that's how the Maxim gun was originally mounted and used. And fairly quickly, countries realized that when you open up with one of those, it has to be at a lot closer range than true artillery, and people start shooting back. And all of a sudden, people got really interested in making those guns very low to the ground and putting little tiny armor shields on them, making them small targets. But they're still meant to be sort of static, emplaced guns. They need water for cooling. You need a lot of logistical support to be able to supply the ammunition that's required to fire at the cadence and that those guns are designed for. And that's the reason that they survive today, is because they were designed to shoot that much. That's why they're still around. So I think I haven't done any really detailed study on this, but where I recall seeing them in Ukraine, especially earlier on in the war, was in trenches in static defensive positions where it doesn't matter that the gun and its mount are 120 or 130 or 40 pounds. It doesn't matter that you have to supply them with water and you have to have pallets of ammunition in the back to exploit them. That's where they were useful. And there are a lot of static defensive positions that can benefit from a gun like that. Now, I think they fairly quickly kind of got outmoded by heavier caliber guns, Dishkas, 50 caliber stuff, and potentially even bigger guns. And then we do also see them sort of thrown into a counter-drone role, at which they're not the worst thing, but they're certainly not the best thing. And Maxim guns were anti-aircraft guns in World War I and in World War II, and a Shahed drone is not that different in performance from a World War I to World War II aircraft. So it makes sense that they would continue to serve in that role reasonably effectively. They weren't super effective as anti-aircraft guns in World War I and World War II, especially World War II. Heavier caliber stuff was a lot more effective, but hey, if we've got these Maxim guns or similar sorts of things, they can do the work. We might as well make use of them as much as we can. And I think that's the same philosophy that you see with them being used against drones today in Ukraine. The other reason, by the way, that they're still in service there is Russia made an absolutely insane number of Maxim guns. Russian industrial production in World War II was just bonkers. And then they never got rid of any of it. If that had been the United States, we would not have warehouses full of Maxims still in storage today. We would have scrapped and surplused and sold off that stuff decades and decades ago when we replaced it with something newer. The Russians didn't. The Russians kept all of that stuff. And they kept it scattered around the Russian Empire, scattered around the Soviet Union, which meant that a lot of it ended up actually in Ukraine. And so when the Soviet Union breaks up, Ukraine ends up with a lot of surplus World War II, Cold War era Soviet guns that were stored in Ukraine that are now Ukrainian. So both sides have large numbers of Maxim guns left over from World War II. And so, of course, they're going to use them. Because they work, because they can still be employed in some specific uses. You're not going to see assault squads taking Maxims, into trench combat, because they're just not any good for that. But for defensive position, for mounting 4 of them side by side by side by side on a truck and using them to try and shoot down Shaheds, if you got it and you don't have something a whole lot better on hand, you might as well use it. Let's see. Victor says, given how needlessly complicated Italian interwar machine guns seem to be, by which I'm pretty sure he's referring to the Breda Model 30, wouldn't it have been better for the Italians to license a different design like the Vickers Berthier? I'm setting aside the ZB-26 due to not very cordial relations between Italy and Czechoslovakia. This is going to be a really short one. Yes, Italy would have been better off adopting basically any other interwar light machine gun besides the Breda 30. The Breda 30 is une catastrophe. Not great. And what's kind of interesting to me, and sad in a way, is the 6.5 Carcano is a really nice, it's at the bottom end of the rifle caliber spectrum for World War I and World War II. And the idea of taking something like a ZB-30 or, a Degtyarev, like a DP-26 or a Bren gun, or a French Châtellerault or a BAR, like any of the other guns, and chambering them for a 6.5 Carcano, that's potentially a really nice, effective light machine gun. It's going to be soft shooting. It's going to be kind of on par with the Nambu Type 96 in 6.5 Arisaka, or 6.5 Japanese. That could have been a really cool gun and really quite effective. But instead they went with the Breda 30, which is not great. We'll just go with not great. Fisk says, with the increase of belt-fed uppers for AR-15s and FRTs becoming more common, do you see any plans for specialty competition shoots for them, kind of like Moon's Out? No. Why not? Well, a couple of reasons. I am dubious. I apologize to the companies who are doing this. They're fantastic people who are very excited and very confident in their work. But I'm very dubious about the long-term viability of any belt-fed AR upper. The problem is, I've talked about many times, trade-offs, compromises. Everything in gun design is a compromise. The AR-15 upper, in order to fit onto a lower and work with the fire control group, is small. And I think it's just too small to make a really, truly effective belt-fed upper that will fit into it. Colt tried this back in the 60s. The original concept was to have a whole family of AR-15 weapons, and they tried belt-fed uppers, and they could just never get one to work. The AR-10 even had issues with a belt-fed upper, although, it's bigger, but it's also using a bigger cartridge. So they just took the same problem and scaled it up a little bit. The belt-fed uppers are all very expensive. Not a lot of people have them, and they're not militarily reliable. And I'm dubious that they ever will be. And so people will take them to competitions and have fun with them, but they're always going to be a niche item, I think, because it's going to take a lot of work and dedication to get them into a configuration where they'll actually work well enough to be competitive in a match. Then the second element of this is, okay, you combine that with an FRT and have essentially a full auto belt-fed AR-15. That's really cool. That's kind of the AR-15 equivalent of having an RPD, which I think is awesome, a lot of fun. FRTs also have issues. FRTs are very high wear guns. If you go look at the work that's been done by someone like Brassfax, his FRTs are wearing out. They don't last all that long because they are essentially brute forcing a machine gun mechanism by which, the bolt carrier is just slamming into these things and having to physically, slam them out of the way. There are forced reset triggers. The forced there is not an accidental inclusion. That's how the thing works. You're putting pressure on this piece in one direction, and the bolt carrier is just slamming it out of the way in the other direction. Real full auto triggers are designed to be durable, and you don't have these huge shock impacts on the parts. FRTs, kind of by definition, work the other way in that they do use a huge shock load to force the thing to reset, and as a result, they wear out. Maybe someone will start making something, one of them or some of them, in really good heavy-duty materials that can last longer. But frankly, if you're not taking the wear in the FRT, if you're making an FRT out of some really good, super strong tool steel, well, then you're just going to put that wear into your bolt carrier instead, and you're going to be wearing out bolt carriers instead of trigger elements. So FRTs are going to have some issues for a lot, people who are going to shoot a lot of ammo in a competitive sort of preparatory sense. If you're dedicated to competition, you're shooting a lot of ammo to get really good and to practice. This is not the same as the majority of FRT owners who get one because it's fun to mag dump a couple times at the range, and then they realize, well, that was actually a lot of ammo, a lot of money worth of ammo, and we'll do that every once in a while for the giggles, but we're not going to do it a lot, and so their FRT is going to last a long time because they're not actually using it. Competitive shooters, those FRTs are going to wear out, and they're not going to be real happy with them. And then the third and final issue is that full auto fire does not help you in competitive shooting. It is actually a detriment because you are shooting a lot more ammo and you are reloading a lot more often, especially like the belt fed, okay, you've got 50 or 100 rounds, but when you do go to reload, you're taking this massive time penalty in reloading compared to anyone with a box magazine. And for what? Like I've shot competitions with machine guns, and you always do substantially worse than anybody with a semi-auto because machine guns are really good at providing suppressive fire, but suppressive fire does not win you competitions. Like single aim shots in the target zone that make hits win you competitions. Suppressive fire doesn't work. It doesn't help, and it's slower. It's good in real life, in a battlefield, but that's not the same as a competition venue. So this has been, a really long answer, in part because I've long wanted to come up with some sort of competition venue where machine guns would be viable, or some way to make machine guns viable in existing competition. I've never been able to come up with anything that worked out. So let's move on to Guido, who says, light machine guns, belt fed versus magazine fed. Overall, which one wins, pros and cons in your opinion? Well, history and practicality and actual adoption and use says belt fed wins. There are very few magazine fed light machine guns in existence in use today. Belt fed has proven to be the better system overall. And in part that's because we've got more experience now. When these guns were first being designed, we just didn't have the experience making them, and it was easier to make a magazine-fed gun, simpler, and it was easier to make a militarily reliable and durable light machine gun that used box magazines rather than trying to kludge a belt into it. Today, we figured out how to do that, and by the way, we're typically using smaller military cartridges today. In World War II, your light machine gun was chambered for 8 Mauser or 30-06 or 303, and today we wouldn't necessarily call that a light machine gun. We call that a general purpose machine gun, and it's a crew-served heavier weapon. In World War II, that gun is very easily operable by one guy. Maybe, ideally you have an assistant gunner just to help him reload fast. Today, what we consider a light machine gun is more like a squad automatic weapon. It's chambered in 5.56, which makes it a bit easier to design a gun that is portable and handy in 5.56 with a belt feed, compared to, take an M240 Bravo. That's a lot of gun to be carrying around compared to a Mini-Me. Now, the Soviets did it well with the PK, but anyway, I'm getting aside from myself. Personally, I like magazine-fed guns. I just think they're more interesting and cooler, and they're a little bit easier to shoot. You don't have to preload belts, and anyway, that's a personal preference. I like light machine gun, box-fed light machine guns, but history has definitively proven that the belt-fed guns are the more useful in the real world. All right, Blue Liner says, of all of the World War I major combatants, which do you believe had the best bolt-action rifle and best machine gun? Do you think the quality of the small arms had an effect on the length and victory in the war, or would the outcome have been the same if they'd all swapped small arms? I'm going to be boring here, maybe uninteresting. I'm going to say it doesn't matter. For rifles, there were a number of different versions, like half of it's Mosins, Mausers, Enfields, basically. And they are mechanically different, but practical handling, they're all basically the same. The Mosin's the worst of them. The Mauser and the Enfield are both quite good in different ways. But it doesn't matter. They all do essentially the same thing, and if you just randomly shuffled them between countries, I don't think anything would have changed. And it's even less relevant with machine guns, because basically there's two machine guns in major use in World War I. It's the Maxim, and variations on the Maxim, and the Hotchkiss. The French use the Hotchkiss. Everybody else uses Maxim guns, essentially. Yes, there are a few others. There's some small-scale production stuff, but largely it's Maxim guns. MG08s for the Germans. I guess the Italians have the Fiat Revelli, and that thing's a catastrophe. But the British have the Vickers, which is a Maxim gun. The Germans have the Maxim gun. The Russians have the Maxim gun. The Americans have, well, we adopted a Maxim gun, but then we actually used Hotchkiss guns from the French. Yeah, they're all the same. Would not have affected the war in any way if those guns were all shuffled around. The war was won by elements that were on such a larger scale than the merits of the individual small arms. All right, a couple more questions here. Joel says, why has delayed blowback been completely abandoned as an operating system for the current generation of rifles? On paper, it's simpler than any of the gas operating systems. It's been proven to work successfully with the G3 and the FAMAS. However, even HK has given up on it. What downsides caused this? I think the big one today is there are probably some manufacturing simplicity issues that we all got sort of used to short stroke gas piston guns and with rotating bolts, and they're easy to make and everyone understands them, and so that's kind of the low friction easy solution. But in terms of mechanical potential, I think the biggest issue with delayed blowback is it kind of has to be tuned to one specific loading of ammunition. Delayed blowback guns are going to be relatively susceptible to changes in pressure because they have to be balanced. The G3, the HK system, has minutely different wedge angles for different uses. The 9mm guns are different from .308, different from .762. The MP5SD, I believe, had its own specific wedge, and we don't necessarily always see that used in civilian guns, but on a military scale where you're using a lot of guns and a lot of ammo through them, that matters. And today, not only do we potentially have different loadings of ammunition that we want to use, but more importantly, we have suppressors. And throwing a suppressor on a delayed blowback gun significantly impacts the dynamics of its operation. That really throws a wrench into the balance of forces going back and forth inside the gun. And on short stroke gas piston guns, it is far easier to add, an extra second or a third gas port size and give yourself a couple of different preset options in a way that you just can't do on a delayed blowback gun. And I think that may not be the reason that they were originally fell out of favor in the late Cold War, but I think that's why we don't see any of them really making a comeback today. So when you're going to do modularity, the gas piston systems are just way more utilitarian to work with. Court says, in the run-up to some unfavorable legislation likely to be enacted soon in Virginia, I've been buying a lot of both pre-89 import ban rifles and also parts kits. Think Beretta AR-70, AR-79, so Beretta AR-70 as a pre-ban gun, AR-70/90 as a parts kit build. I'd be interested in your opinion on the relative merits of pre-ban guns versus kit builds. Which would you rather have access to as a buyer and collector? On a related note, are you aware of any foreign manufacturers who have sold newly manufactured parts kits into the US in the same manner as like cut up surplus kits. So first off, I'm really not familiar with anyone selling parts kits into the US. I've seen some discussion of it, and it might, sorry about that, it might happen in small scale, but not on any sort of large scale. Now, I think the more substantial discussion here is semi-auto factory guns versus parts kit builds. The factory guns are in every way better, in my opinion. If I ever have the choice between like a pre-import ban factory configuration gun and a gun that was built up on a parts kit using an American-made receiver, I will want the factory gun every time. And it's because it is an original factory product. That factory making the gun knew how to build those guns, and they're going to do it right. And they're also, in my experience, for me personally, they have a lot more collector value. I would much rather have the actual product than half the actual product and half a small shop in the US that comes up with a way to make one extra part so that we can assemble these cut up surplus guns into live weapons again. Now, when the factory guns aren't available, for example, Beretta AR-7090s, the FAMAS Félin or FAMAS Valorisé, the modernized FAMAS that we're getting just trickle of parts kits in the US, guns like that where there is no factory option, then a parts kit is massively better than not having anything at all. But if I can have a factory pre-ban gun, that's going to be better every time as a shooter and a collector and basically everything. Let's see. All right, we've got just a couple more here because my voice is starting to run out. And I'm out of whiskey. Well, I'm not out, but I'm not going to get drunk on camera here. James says, actually we have two questions here that are very similar to each other. So James says, FDR appoints you the Secretary of Armaments in the mid-1930s to oversee rearmament and expansion of the military prior to World War II. What U.S. small arms would you change? Would you adopt 276 Pedersen or change any other calibers? Anything is on the table as long as it was around before 1939. And Andy essentially has half of that question. He says, you get the final say on the Garand's adoption and have two choices, 10-round en-bloc clip in 276 or 30-06 with box magazines and a stripper clip guide. 10 rounds there as well. What do you choose? So if I get to make the decisions for American small arms, the US probably did the smart thing logistically by sticking to 30-06. I think the 276 Pedersen is awesome, and I want to live in a world where there are 276 caliber M1s, and so I would switch the U.S. rifle caliber to 276 Pedersen. In the M1, not in the Pedersen rifle, but in the M1 Garand, a 10-round en-bloc clip of 276 Pedersen. I have handled those rifles. I've shot a Pedersen rifle. It's nice. It's a nicer gun to shoot than a 30-06. I've handled an M1 in 276. I couldn't shoot it, but I have handled it. It is a lighter, handier, nicer gun than an M1 Garand. I think it would be an absolutely fantastic service weapon. Now, the 1919 A4 in 276 is maybe not as useful. I guess we'll adopt that alongside and just accept that it's not quite as ballistically capable as the gun that we actually used. Let's see, we should have replaced the Thompson before World War II. Like in virtue of hindsight, knowing what's coming, the Thompson was not a good choice. The ricing was, in theory, we should have just adopted 9mm for submachine guns and taken, frankly, I guess here it is. If you're going to give me total power to do this, I'm going to replace 45 with 9mm. The US is going to adopt probably the Suomi. I think that is an outstanding submachine gun that the US would have done very good work with in World War II. We're going to ditch the Thompson. The Suomi kind of weighs about the same amount, but handles much more nicely, holds way more ammunition, and is a better submachine gun in pretty much every way. We'll adopt a 9mm pistol. I don't really care what it is. It doesn't really matter. Browning high power, great choice. We'll go with Browning high powers in 9mm. I would take the BAR. We can leave the BAR as long as we adopt some of the updates to it, the things that Colt and FN were doing by giving it a pistol grip. In 276, maybe we can squeeze out a 25 or even 30 round magazine, replace the magazine release with the FND style with like the little pull lever instead of the stupid button in the front of the trigger guard. In theory, a ZB26 in 276 Pedersen, a gun like that would probably be even better if we have the money to do it. At this point, I've completely obliterated the War Department's budget for small arms. Like, the reason they didn't update the BARs is because they didn't want to spend the money on it. They had BARs, they worked fine. Yeah, they were obsolete by World War II, but whatever, they work fine. We don't have the money to replace them. So I'm assuming unlimited money here, but yeah, I think that does a pretty good job. We replaced the BAR with a ZB26, replaced the M1 with a 10-round N-block fed 276 caliber M1, Suomi submachine guns, Browning high-power pistols. Yeah, there we go. And now we're going to win World War II even faster and better. I don't know that the small arms would make that much difference, but at that level, like, you might have gotten a little bit of a difference in combat effectiveness at this point. And it would create a whole slew of fantastically awesome surplus guns that we could have today. Felix says, I have your book about NATO Cold War battle rifles and I love it. Thank you, Felix. I actually was incredibly happy with how that one turned out. It looks great. Is there a chance that there will also be a book about NATO Cold War submachine guns? Because there's so much more than the Uzi and MP5. Yes, there is definitely, like, that is going to happen. James Rupley and I have talked about that. We actually have two things in mind, and I'm not sure which one will happen first. One is Cold War submachine guns, and the other is Cold War assault rifles. The battle rifle book pretty much covers the first half of the Cold War with all of the 7.62 NATO and equivalent stuff, but there's a whole second half to the Cold War when everyone switched to 5.56, and the US goes from the M14 to the M16. In Italy, you get the AR-70s and 70-90s. We have the FNCs, we have the AUGs, we have the L-85s, the G30, well, sort of the G36. But the 1970s to 1990 sort of period, or 60s to 1990 period of 5.56 caliber assault rifles in the Cold War is a partner book to the battle rifle book that is absolutely going to happen. I just don't have a time frame for it because I have a lot of projects all going on at the same time. All right, and we've got one more question here, which is from Christopher, who says, what subset of collectible firearms do you think is criminally undervalued, if any? For example, values for old Colts are pretty high. Anything World War II is as well. There's got to be some interesting area that collectors just don't seem to care about for some inexplicable reason that would make a fine way to build a neat collection without needing a pawnbroker and a divorce lawyer. So I would say there are two things. The stuff that's expensive is expensive because it is limited in supply and a lot of people are interested in it. So World War II German stuff. It's limited in supply, although there's a lot more than most people maybe think. But everybody thinks it's really cool and really collectible, and so everyone wants to have it. If you want to get stuff that is inexpensive, you need to have either a lot of supply or not a lot of interest, or ideally both. If you can find something that is in massive supply and very little interest, it'll be super cheap. Most Nagant 9130s 10 or 20 years ago. They were in by the bucket load, and that's why they were less than $100. I think looking to see what's cheap and collecting that is maybe not the best plan. I think it's better to figure out what you're interested in and then find what element of that is affordable to your level of income and interest in spending on a collection. So, like, don't just go to Gunbroker, sort by price, low to high, and buy everything that's cheap. You'll end up with a lot of crap. And it's stuff, like, even if it's interesting guns, it may not be something that you're interested in. So the things that are currently being imported at any given time are always going to be the least expensive and the most accessible, because people look at that and they inevitably think, like, oh, well, that's not the good stuff. The good stuff is the stuff that came in 10 years ago and, you know, and it all sold out because it was great, and that's why we can't have it anymore. And I want to go find a Finnish Mosin that was $79 when it came in, and now it's $800. But this is a revolving cycle. In 10 years, the stuff that's being imported cheap right now is going to be 3 times as expensive once it sells out. People don't buy it when it's available retail because they look at it and they go, well, like, I can always buy that later. It's just click an order and then there it is. And so I don't really care about it that much. It's not that special. And then as soon as it sells out, people are like, oh, I really wanted one of the blah, 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 whatever the thing was. And now it's sold out. So now the prices go up and now it sucks to have to buy it. So find that, like, when people are importing stuff that you think is interesting, think about it consciously and be like, this is my opportunity to get that. If you like Zastava stuff, we have a massive amount of Zastava handguns that are coming into the country right now because there's a ton of it being imported from Serbia. Serbia changed their gun laws. The police confiscated up a whole bunch, well, or people turned in because they no longer could get the licenses to own a whole bunch of handguns that got imported into the US by like the container load, and I'm seeing them every day in advertisements. They're cheap. There's a wide variety of them. If that's something that you think is cool, this is the time to buy it. Buy it while it's retail instead of waiting until 10 years from now when it's all been sold off and you have to go onto the collector sites to try and find that one interesting version that, you know what? That one interesting version is in my email right now on an advertising flyer for $199.99. This is the time to get it. So that's one recommendation that I would give you. And the other is find something that you think is interesting that everyone else doesn't think is interesting. In a way, gun collecting used to be a defined hobby. If you were a firearms collector, it was because you had the money and the class and the taste to accumulate the set of guns that everyone recognized were collectible guns, which meant Colts and Winchesters. But that's not how, I don't think that's how it is today, and it's certainly not how it has to be or how it should be. Gun collecting should be something that you do because you are interested in it. Nobody else has to care. It's cool when other people do share your interest, but this is something that you should engage in because it makes you happy, not because you're buying a bunch of stuff to make everyone else think that you're cool. Buy the stuff that you actually want yourself. So some people, unfortunately, are going to find that the things that they're particularly interested in happen to be the things that are really expensive because other people like them too. But you may well find that you can get really interested in some field that is way off the beaten path for most people. And if that coincides with stuff that's currently being imported, fantastic. But even if it doesn't, you know what? Find the thing that you like and focus on collecting that. So that is all the questions that I have the mental bandwidth and the voice for today. A big thank you to everybody on Patreon, on the Forgotten Weapons Patreon. You guys are invaluable to supporting the channel. You guys also, by the way, for those of you who aren't in the Patreon, patrons get a feed in their email of every video that I put out completely ad-free. So if you're sick of seeing advertisements in any of these videos and you don't want to pay YouTube for YouTube Premium, well, sign up for Patreon. You'll get the ad-free feed of videos as well as some other perks. At the $20 level, you get early access to videos. That's usually a month or so in advance. Cool stuff that other people don't have access to see. And at the $2 level, every month when I'm going to do a Q&A, I put out a request on Patreon for questions. And so everyone at the $2 a month level and higher gets that email, and your questions come in. And I can't answer every question. I do get too many, but those are that's how you get a question in for the Q&As. So hopefully you enjoyed this one. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next month on the next Q&A and in like 2 days for the next regular gun video.